In this video, I'm going to show you how I built this miter saw station that I've been wanting for a long time, but some much needed storage that I've desperately been needing. Thanks to Delta for making this possible with the compact design of the new Cruiser. My old 12-inch sliding miter saw was simply way too big and the bars in the back stuck out too far from the wall to make this possible. I started like I do most projects by breaking down some 3/4 inch plywood with the track saw. I'm cutting the cabinet dividers at a height of 39 inches and then a depth of 27 inches. I'm a taller guy, so this is a perfect comfortable working height for me. As you can see behind me, the bank of cabinets that ends up being to the left of the miter saw is already there, which is nice for me because I would have really only needed to show building one side on video anyway, so I'm just building the mirror image of what's there for the right side of the saw. With all the panels cut, I then notched out the 3-inch toe kick on the front. Next, I ripped down all the stretcher pieces that would connect the panels and cut them to length. To connect the pieces, I'm just drilling some pocket holes on both ends of all the stretchers. I put 2 stretchers on the back, one up top in the front, and then one along the toe kick at the bottom. When screwing in 2 pieces like this, you just want to make sure you offset your pocket holes so you don't run into the screws coming from the other side. The only difference between this side that I'm building and the other is right here where I'm dropping down the top of the cabinet where the belt sander sits. Then it was just more of the same connecting all the stretcher pieces, except for the 2 sections where the cabinet doors are. I went ahead and used a full panel so the back is closed. Then I glued and nailed on some supports for the bottom shelves on these 2 sections, and also where the sander sits as well. Next, I could start working on the face frame. 2x4 construction lumber definitely wouldn't be my first choice for this, but that's what they used on the other cabinets, so I wanted them to match. And really, I think the beefy look of them ends up looking pretty good with how big the cabinets are. I jointed one face and one edge to get them nice and square, and then planed them down to a thickness of 1 1/4 inch before ripping them to a final width of 3 inches on the table saw. To connect the pieces, I once again used pocket holes since they were going to be so big and had no real good way to clamp them. I'm drilling the holes on both ends of just the rails, and if you aren't familiar, the rails are the horizontal pieces, like a handrail, and the vertical pieces are called stiles. Next, I could start gluing and screwing them all together. I like to cut some spacers the exact width of the drawer opening, which on these big drawers was 10 1/8 inch. Then I can continue to move it around so they're all the same and both ends are square. And then this left me with a 4-inch opening on the top drawers. It was just more of the same as I worked across the frame, with the only exception being not adding the top piece where the sander goes. To attach the face frame, I figured it'd be easiest to just go ahead and lay the cabinets down, so I could then add glue, lay the frame on, and then brad nail it since I was painting them anyways, and the holes could be filled, along with any knots in the pine. After standing the unit back up, I could get it all leveled out, which my shop floor is pretty good, and I only needed to shim up the far right side just a little bit. Next, I started working on the platform for the miter saw, and here I'm just making sure the center supports are out of the way for the dust port that I'd be adding later on. I'll be sure to leave links down below for all the products and tools you see me using if you want to check them out more. Before connecting the pieces, I drilled some holes for these threaded inserts. These would allow me to perfectly fine-tune and adjust the countertop height itself. With the platform together, I marked a level line on the cabinets and then screwed it in. And since I was only screwing into 3/4 inch plywood, I went ahead and drilled some holes so I could add a couple bolts on each side as well, just to really make sure it didn't move over time. With the bases done, I could start working on the countertops. This is 3/4 inch particle board, which is pretty typical for laminated countertops, and it's cheap, so that's always nice. To thicken up the top, I glued 2 pieces together and then put in a bunch of screws to act as clamps until it dried. This is typically done by just adding strips along the edges to make the top look thick, but I actually wanted the heftiness of the top, if that's a word. It helps prevent it from sagging and dishing out over time too, and I also needed more meat to route and screw my T-track into later on. To make it easier gluing up, I only cut one side the exact size I needed, and then the second piece I left a little big, so afterwards I could just come around with a flush trim bit and the router to even them up. After the glue had dried, I just quickly went through and made sure there were no screws in the general area where I'd be routing out the groove for the T-track. Next, I could work on adding the laminate to the countertops. I started by doing the edges, and you can usually cut this stuff on the table saw, but my fence had a little gap that it would just slide under, so I just overhung the sheet off my table a couple of inches and used the router to cut the strips. With the strips cut, I applied the contact cement to both the countertop and the laminate. You then let it dry until they're just tacky. It dries pretty quick, so I actually went ahead and did 2 coats on each to just make sure I'd get a really good bond. Once the 2 pieces touched, they bond together, so to prevent that until I was ready for them to, I just laid down those offcuts from the 2x4s earlier. Then I pulled them out as I worked across with a pressure roller. This really is a pretty fast process, surprisingly. By the time I got all the sections done, I could then go around and start trimming off the excess with the router on the first ones. Once you've routed off the excess, don't take your hand and feel how smooth it is, because it's really sharp. Trust me. You can take a file or sandy block to round it over. Before applying the laminate to the tops, I went ahead and cut out that hole for the dust port. The plunge saw gave a really quick and perfect cut here. To apply the tops, it was the same process, just on a larger scale. A bigger roller would have been nice here, but I think the whole world decided to paint their house during this pandemic, and the store has been completely out for a while now. I'll also mention I had all my windows open with fans blowing out, but once I started doing the top, the fumes were absolutely terrible from the contact cement, and I had to put my respirator on too. There are other kinds you can get that don't smell as bad, but if you ever do this, just make sure you have good ventilation. This offset base you can get for the Milwaukee router is incredibly nice, by the way, for edge trimming. It makes it way more stable, and this thing is just a beast in power in general. As soon as the cabinets were set, I started rolling on primer paint, so they were ready to go once the countertops were done. Next up was to make all the drawer boxes from 3/4 inch plywood. The drawers and the countertop materials were really the only wood I had to buy for this project. Everything else was just scrap from other projects and wood I had on hand that I had been saving up for this. Since 3/4 inch plywood isn't truly 3/4 of an inch, I like to cut the 2 side pieces first and set them in place to measure the front and back pieces, also subtracting an inch for the drawer slides. After cutting all the pieces to size, I set the table saw blade at a depth of 3/8 of an inch and ran all the pieces through to create a groove for the drawer bottom to slide in. I ran all the pieces through, then bumped the fence over to make a second pass wide enough for the 1/4 inch plywood. To join the pieces, I drilled pocket holes on the front of the front pieces and on the back of the back pieces. The front would be covered and the back is, well, in the back. So this way there's no visible fasteners anywhere on the drawer, and they're really quick and easy to make. Before installing the drawers, I just had to go through and glue and nail on some filler strips to bring them flush with the face frame. To set and space my drawers, I've always just used scrap wood to sit the slides and drawers on. Check out my other videos if you'd like to see that process. But crazy enough, I had used up all my scrap wood and didn't have anything that would work. So I figured it was a good time to try out this Craig jig that I've had for probably a couple years now. They were actually really nice and easy to use, but I don't like how you clamp them on the face frame and mar up the finish, like on paint that hasn't fully cured yet in my case. After the first one, I covered the hard plastic with some painter's tape, and that definitely helped a lot though. I also added the drawer slides to the countertop section where the sander sits. This was kind of a last minute idea while I was working, and I'm really glad I did it. It's just a simple addition, and really I planned on there being one of those small drawers here anyway, so I had ordered the slides. Now if I wanted to cut a long board on this side of the saw, I can simply pull the sander out of the way. With the drawers installed, I could start making all the door and drawer fronts out of 3/4 inch poplar that I ripped to 3 inches for the frame and paneled fronts, and just solid 5.5 inch wide pieces for the small drawers. At the router table, I ran all the pieces through with the groove bit for the center panel to slide in. Then I switched over to the tongue bit to cut both ends of all the rail pieces. Then simply add glue to the tongues, slide in the center panel, which I use 1/4 inch MDF because it paints really well, and then clamp them up. This was the longest process of the whole build because I didn't have enough clamps. Hint hint, if my wife is watching this, my birthday is coming up. But after a couple hours I could take them out and clamp up another handful. Since I had 1/4 inch MDF to use for the doors, I went ahead and used it for the drawers as well. But to keep the panel from pulling in when I added the drawer pulls, I just filled in the void with offcuts. To prime and paint, I quickly popped up my little spray booth in the shop and first used my Earlex 5500 HVLP gun to spray Ben primer. This is my go-to primer, and the HVLP sprays it really well since it's so thin. And it's a shellac based primer, so I'd much rather clean that out of this gun than my airless. But to paint, I switched over to my Graco airless sprayer so I wouldn't have to thin the paint like you would with the HVLP, which on this urethane Alkyd enamel would really affect the durability. With the paint drying, I went ahead and moved the saw in its new home, squared it up where I wanted it, and then screwed it down. Then I could use those leveling bolts to bring the saw up exactly where I wanted it, just a tiny bit higher than the side countertops. Next up was routing out the groove for the T-track. I added some double-sided tape in the middle of a long straight edge and clamped down both ends. I also used some tape and CA glue to attach a block at the end to eliminate any blowout by the router bit. I put a 3/4 inch straight bit in the router and cut just a hair deeper than the 3/8 inch aluminum track. To put in the tape measure, I bumped my guide over a 1/2 inch, raised the bit up to just the shallow thickness I needed, and made a second pass. And here's one spot where I was really glad I took the minute to double check the location of all those screws. The T-track is aluminum, so it can be cut with a regular miter saw. I just wouldn't use a good blade. After going through with a self-centering drill bit, I could lock the track down with some black screws. The tape measure has an adhesive back on it itself, but I thought it would be a good idea to use some magnetic tape first. Then I could just leave the paper on the steel tape and be able to peel it up or adjust it if needed and not ruin the stickiness on the tape measure. To find exactly where the blade cuts, I glued down a piece of wood so it wouldn't move and made a cut. Then I could line up the 0 mark on this right to left reading tape measure. Even with the paper still on the back, the magnet tape grabs it really good and it won't move unless I really want it to and try. With the paint dry, I could drill and attach my door hinges, and I also drilled for all the drawer pulls. I always like to work with gravity, so to attach the fronts, I clamped my straight board 3/4 of an inch down from the openings, since I made all the fronts with a 3/4 inch overlay. Then I could just make a mark 3/4 of an inch on one side of the opening, sit the front on the ledge, and then use those drawer pull holes I previously drilled to temporarily attach it to the drawer. Then I pull the drawer out and permanently attach it from the inside. Then I can go ahead and remove the screws from the front, drill all the way through the drawer box, and then attach the hardware. This makes the cabinet doors really easy too. Just set it on the ledge, screw on the hinges, and everything lines up perfect. With the bottom row done, I then just needed a 1.5 inch spacer to continue setting the rest. One of the last finishing touches was making the stop block for the T-track. I cut down some small pieces of ash that go inside the track to keep the block from just spinning. I left them sticking up proud of the top so I could glue the block to them and then sand them down after. With the block flush with the top, I added a small piece of aluminum for a little added durability. Then I drilled the hole for the bolt to go through and countersunk some screws into the aluminum as well. It was a pretty cool feeling being dead on accurate with the first test cut. And lastly, I made up the dust hood from some 1/2 inch MDF. The 1/4 inch front was just a lot of back and forth to the jigsaw to get a nice fit, but it turned out really good. After painting the hood to match the cabinets, of course, I used the rest of that magnetic tape on both the hood and the front panel. This seals it up really nice, but it's still easy to remove for when I need to make miter cuts. Here I'm drilling a hole for the saw power cord, and I added one of these plug grommets as well. I also had to drill a hole in the countertop for the vacuum cord to come up and plug in. It was kind of a bummer to drill this hole because this setup is only temporary. My shop is kind of unique in that there's actually a basement under this back half of the shop. So when I get my dust collection system set up down there, the pipe will just pop right up through the floor into the bottom of the saw. But if you've seen any of my other videos, you know how much I use and how good these dust stoppers work at separating the dust and keeping the vacuum filter clean, at least in the meantime. Alright, thanks for watching. Hopefully you were inspired or learned some tips and tricks along the way to help you if you decide to build something like this. You guys know the drill. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and liking the video. And everything I use will be linked down in the description. Until next time, take care.